The moment Cora Conley opened her mouth in the middle of the Dusty Creek Saloon and told Wesley Rhodes that he was dead wrong about the cattle trail, every man in that sawdust-floored room went so quiet you could hear the flies buzzing against the window glass. It was the summer of 1878, and the town of Harlan's Crossing, Texas, was the kind of place that the railroad had not yet reached, and God seemed to visit only occasionally. It sat baked under a relentless sun, positioned along the Kishom Trail's eastern fork, where drovers came through with their herds, their dust, their money, and their opinions. Opinions were plentiful in Harlan's Crossing. Fact was considerably more scarce. And Cora Conley, who had been running the town's modest but immaculate boarding house since her father passed 3 years prior, had grown thoroughly exhausted by the difference between the two. She was 26 years old. With dark brown hair she kept pinned up so tightly that strangers sometimes assumed she was severe. She was not severe. She was precise. There was a considerable difference, and she had learned not to bother explaining it to people who would not understand it anyway. She had grown up in Harlan's Crossing, had attended its one-room schoolhouse, had read every book her father brought back from his cattle trading trips to San Antonio, and had quietly developed a mind that was considerably sharper than the town had any particular use for. She managed the boarding house with a steady hand, kept an honest ledger, grew a kitchen garden that was the envy of every woman on the main street, and minded her business with a discipline that had earned her a reputation for being, as old Marshal Etta Greer once put it, fine company so long as you don't say something foolish. Wesley Rhodes was, by almost any measure, not the kind of man who should have been saying foolish things that particular Tuesday afternoon. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who have spent a decade driving cattle across the Texas plains, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that had a habit of observing a room from whatever corner he stood in, as though he were always calculating the distance to the nearest exit. He had ridden into Harlan's Crossing 2 weeks prior at the head of a drive from the King Ranch's eastern pastures, and in those 2 weeks he had established himself as competent, fair-dealing, quiet, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from actually knowing what you are doing. The men who rode under him respected him. The merchants he dealt with trusted him. Even Marshal Greer, who trusted almost no one, had made a point of saying he seemed decent. What Wesley Rhodes was not, and had perhaps never been properly informed of, was infallible. On that Tuesday afternoon, the cattle drive had concluded its business in Harlan's Crossing, the herd having been sold and counted, and the money distributed with admirable honesty among the drovers. Several of the men had congregated in the saloon, which was operated by a wide-shouldered woman named Pearl Hutchins, who poured fair measures, and did not tolerate fighting on account of a back injury that made sweeping up after brawls more trouble than it was worth. Wesley sat at a corner table with 2 of his drovers, a map spread before him, and a glass of whiskey at his elbow. Cora had come in to deliver a message to Pearl from the dressmaker across the street, and she had paused, as she sometimes did, because Pearl's saloon had the best cross-breeze in town on account of the 2 windows Pearl had insisted on having cut into the north wall. That was when she heard Wesley Rhodes explaining, with the full confidence of a man who believed he was the most informed person in any given room, that the eastern cutoff past Miller Creek was the faster route back toward the King Ranch, and that any man who said otherwise was either a fool or had never actually ridden it in summer. Cora paused at the bar. She set Pearl's message down carefully. She turned and looked at the table where Wesley sat. His 2 drovers were nodding along in the easy way of men who agreed with whoever was paying them, and Wesley was drawing a finger along the paper map with the absolute certainty of someone who has been correct about enough things that he has perhaps stopped double-checking. "That is not right," Cora said. The saloon went quiet. Not the dramatic quiet of a gunfight about to happen, but the stunned, collective quiet of a room full of people who had just witnessed something entirely unexpected. 3 men at the bar turned slowly on their stools. Pearl looked up from the glass she was wiping. Wesley's 2 drovers stared at Cora as though she had materialized from somewhere outside ordinary reality. Wesley himself looked up slowly. His dark eyes found her with the measured calm of a man who was not accustomed to being interrupted, let alone corrected. He studied her for a moment as if waiting for her to reconsider what she had just said. Cora did not reconsider it. She walked over to the table, which required crossing the entire length of the saloon under the collective gaze of 12 men and Pearl Hutchins, and she pointed at the map. "The eastern cutoff past Miller Creek floods in summer," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Has flooded every July since 1871. My father drove cattle for 20 years on this range, and he never once took that route in summer because the low ground past the ridge holds water from the spring melt until August. You will lose 3 days, minimum, waiting for your horses to find solid footing, and you may lose an animal or 2 to the mud if you push too hard." Wesley looked at her. He looked at the map. Then he looked back at her. "You have ridden that cutoff in summer?" he asked. His tone was not hostile, but it was skeptical in the manner of a man who has been given incorrect information before and has learned to require evidence. "I have not ridden it," Cora said, "because I am not in the habit of doing things my father specifically told me were foolish. But I have spoken with every drover who came through Harlan's crossing between 1871 and 1875, and every single one who attempted that eastern cutoff in July or August came back to this town to resupply because they had lost time they could not afford. Ask Pearl. She remembers their supply orders." Everyone looked at Pearl. Pearl set down her glass, picked up the one next to it, and began wiping it with the unhurried dignity of a woman who knew things. "She is correct," Pearl said. "Summers in 72, 74, and 76. 6 separate trail bosses came back through here after the eastern cutoff. All of them looked like they had been arguing with the ground and lost." Another beat of silence. Wesley looked at the map for a long moment. Then he looked up at Cora again, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something that might, in a different light, have looked like recalibration. "What route would you take?" he asked. It was such a direct, unguarded question that Cora blinked. She had prepared herself for defensiveness, for dismissal, for the particular brand of tolerant condescension that men in Harlan's crossing typically deployed when she said something they did not wish to hear. She had not prepared for a genuine question delivered with genuine curiosity. She pointed at the map. "The Western Fork adds half a day initially," she said, "but the ground is higher and drains quickly. You can make up the time on the flat stretch south of Caldwell's Ridge, and you come into the King Ranch from the southwest, which puts you ahead of the afternoon heat during the last 2 driving hours. My father called it the honest route. It does not look like the better choice on paper, but it is the better choice on the ground." Wesley studied the map. He studied it for a long time, long enough that one of his drovers shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Then he nodded once with the decisive quality of a man who has made his decision and will not be revisiting it. "Thank you," he said. He looked up at her directly. "I am Wesley Rhodes." "I know who you are," Cora said. "You have been in this town for 2 weeks. And you are Cora Conley. I run the boarding house on Elm Street." Wesley nodded again, as if filing this information away somewhere important. Cora picked up Pearl's message from the bar where she had set it down, delivered it to Pearl, exchanged a few words about a hat order from the dressmaker, and walked back out into the afternoon sun with the same measured pace she had walked in with. She told herself she had done nothing remarkable. She had simply corrected an error, the same way she would have corrected a wrong figure in a ledger. She walked back to the boarding house, checked the bread she had put in to rise, wrote 3 letters, and went to bed at a sensible hour, thinking very little about Wesley Rhodes or his dark, assessing eyes or the way he had said "thank you" as though he meant it. She thought about it for approximately 2 hours before she fell asleep, which she also told herself was not remarkable. The next morning, Wesley Rhodes appeared at the door of her boarding house at 7 o'clock with his hat in his hands. Cora was in the process of carrying a pot of coffee from the kitchen to the dining room where 3 of her current boarders were waiting for breakfast. She stopped in the doorway between the hall and the sitting room, and he was standing on the porch through the screen door, and for a moment they simply looked at each other through the mesh. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "You may come in," she said, "but I have boarders to feed first." He came in. He sat at the kitchen table, which was where she indicated, and he held his hat and did not fidget with it, which she noticed, and she poured coffee for her boarders and set out the breakfast plates and came back to the kitchen with a second cup of coffee, which she set in front of him. He accepted it with a quietness that she found, without quite meaning to, rather agreeable. When she sat down across from him with her own cup, he said, "I rode out to Miller Creek this morning at first light." Cora set her cup down. "You rode to Miller Creek and back before 7 in the morning. I wanted to see for myself," he said. There was no defensiveness in it. It was simply what he had done. "You were right. The low ground is saturated. We would have been in trouble by midday." Cora considered this for a moment. She had been right, and she had known she was right, and she found that she respected considerably the fact that he had gone to verify it rather than either accepting her word or dismissing it. It was the action of a man who dealt in evidence, and she had considerable respect for evidence. "My father always said the land does not lie," she said. "It is only our maps that do." Something moved in his eyes at that. "He sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," Cora said simply. She wrapped both hands around her cup and let a small silence settle between them in the way that small silences sometimes can, comfortably, when neither person is frightened of it. "What did you want to ask me?" she said. "Would you be willing to sit with me this evening and look at the full return route?" he said. "I have maps going back to 1869, but they were drawn by men who did not spend much time on the ground. I think they may have other errors I have not found yet." Cora looked at him steadily. It was a practical request, entirely proper, and also, she recognized, something of an excuse to spend time with her. She was 26 and had not spent significant time being naive about the intentions of the men who came through Harlan's crossing, but she found that she did not object to this particular intention, which was itself something of a novelty. "After supper," she said, 6 o'clock. "I have bread to bake in the afternoon and accounts to settle." 6 o'clock, he agreed. He drank his coffee, thanked her, put his hat on, and left. Cora sat for a moment after the screen door closed, listening to his boots on the porch steps, and told herself firmly that she was simply helping a man avoid a navigational error that could cost his employer livestock and money. This was a civic contribution. Nothing more. She baked particularly good bread that afternoon. He arrived at 6 o'clock exactly, which she also noticed. He brought the maps rolled under one arm and a small paper package which turned out, when she unwrapped it somewhat cautiously, to contain 2 pieces of apple cake from the bakery 2 doors down from the saloon. He had remembered, from some detail of the morning's conversation she could not immediately identify, that she had mentioned her father's fondness for apple cake. She did not comment on this. She set the cake aside for after, put the lamp on the sitting room table where her father used to do his accounts, and they spread the maps out together and went to work. What she found over the course of the next 2 hours was that Wesley Rhodes was genuinely interesting to disagree with. He was not easily convinced, which she respected. He asked specific questions. When she said something, he listened to it fully before responding, which was rarer than it should have been. He knew the land in the way of a man who had physically covered it on horseback season after season, and she knew it in the way of a woman who had grown up on stories from men who had done the same, and when their knowledge overlapped it confirmed itself, and when it diverged they pulled it apart carefully, and found usually that they were describing different aspects of the same truth. They identified 2 more potential routing errors in his maps. He made corrections in pencil in a handwriting that was neat and economical, the handwriting of a man who wrote carefully because he did not do it often. Cora thought about that. She thought about a great many things she tried not to visibly think about while he was sitting 2 feet away at her father's table with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his hat hung on the hook by the door as naturally as if he had hung it there 100 times before. When they finished with the maps, he rolled them up, and they ate the apple cake. He told her about growing up in Gonzales County, the youngest of 4 brothers, and how he had started working cattle at 14, because the farm had needed the money, and he had been the only one who did not hate being on horseback. She told him about her father, James Conley, who had been a cattle trader rather than a driver, a man of extraordinary patience and extraordinary stubbornness in equal and competing measure, who had taught her to read maps and keep accounts and think for herself because he had only the one child and had seen no reason to provide her with a lesser education than he would have given a son. Most men would have, Wesley said. Most men would have, she agreed. My father was not most men. No, Wesley said, looking at her with that steady quality his gaze had. I expect that runs in the family. Cora felt heat rise along the back of her neck and was grateful for the lamplight that she hoped disguised it. She said something sensible about the late hour and needing to prepare the morning's breakfast, and he took his maps and his hat and thanked her in that direct, unadorned way of his and walked back down Elm Street into the dark, and Cora stood on her porch for an unreasonable amount of time watching the darkness where he had gone. The next morning he was back, this time with a legitimate reason. 2 of his drovers had decided to stay in Harlan's Crossing an extra night, and he needed to book them into the boarding house as paying guests. This was entirely legitimate and somewhat inconvenient because Cora had only 1 room available, but she managed it with a roll-away cot and charged a fair price, and while she was sorting out the logistics, Wesley stood in the hallway and told her that he had already sent a rider ahead on the corrected western route to alert the King Ranch of their adjusted timing. You made the change this quickly, she said. Good information is worth acting on quickly, he said. Sitting on good information until it becomes irrelevant is one of the more common mistakes I have seen men make. Cora looked at him. Is that a philosophy you apply broadly? She asked. There was a layer beneath the question that she had not entirely intended to put there, but she left it. He looked at her with that slight recalibration in his expression that she was beginning to recognize. I am trying to, he said. The rest of that day he helped her without being asked. This was not something she had expected. He carried a repaired section of fence from the back gate to the shed when he saw her struggling with it. He fixed the latch on the kitchen window that had been sticking for 2 months, using a pocket knife and a methodical approach that had it working in 10 minutes. He did all of this without fanfare or expectation, and when she thanked him he simply nodded and went about his business. It occurred to Cora, watching him from the kitchen window as he talked quietly with her 2 new boarders out in the yard, that she had never in her life met a man who was so comprehensively without performance. He did not seem to be doing things to be seen doing them. He simply did what was in front of him that needed doing, and that quality, so simple and so rare, was doing something complicated to her composure. She caught herself humming while she made supper. She almost never hummed. The drive was due to leave Harlan's Crossing in 4 days. Cora knew this with the precision of a woman who had been making a point of not thinking about it, which is the surest way to think about nothing else. The cattle were sold, the supplies were purchased and packed, and Wesley's men were rested and ready. There was no logistical reason for a delay. She told herself this while setting tables and answered herself that she had not asked for a delay and had no intention of doing so. On the 2nd day after their map session, Wesley came by the boarding house in the late afternoon and asked if she would walk with him to look at the small creek that ran along the eastern edge of town. He had noticed, he said, that the water level seemed lower than it should be for this time of year, and he was curious whether she knew if there had been work done upstream. She did know. She put on her good walking hat and told him about the Harmon brothers, who had diverted a portion of the creek 2 years ago to water their expanded cornfield, and the subsequent argument at the town council meeting that had been resolved through a compromise that neither party was happy with, which in her experience was the hallmark of an effective compromise. They walked along the creek bank in the long light of a Texas summer afternoon, and the conversation moved from the creek to the town's history, from the town's history to the broader question of what the railroad's eventual arrival would mean for a place like Harlan's Crossing. Wesley thought it would mean growth and prosperity. Cora thought it would mean growth, and was less certain about the prosperity because she had read accounts from other frontier towns that had acquired railroads and found that what grew was not always what had made the place worth living in. "You read widely," Wesley said. He said it without condescension, more as an observation, as though he were identifying a feature of terrain. "I read everything I can get access to," Cora said. "Books, newspapers, government reports. My father had a standing order with a bookseller in San Antonio. I still do." Wesley was quiet for a moment. "I can read well enough," he said, with a candor that surprised her slightly. "But I was not educated past 14. There are gaps." "There are different kinds of knowing," Cora said, thinking of how he had talked about the land the other night, with a precision and detail that no book had given him. "You know this country the way I know my ledger. That is not a small thing." He looked at her, and the late light was doing complicated things to the shadows along his jaw, and Cora looked at the creek with great dedication for a moment. "I think," Wesley said carefully, "that you are one of the most interesting people I have encountered in a considerable number of years of encountering people." Cora looked back at him. "I think," she said with equal care, "that you may be the first man in my memory who responded to being corrected in public by coming back the next morning." His mouth curved. It was not quite a smile yet, but it was the material from which smiles were made. "You were right," he said simply. "Being right deserves acknowledgement. Being wrong deserves the same." They walked back to the boarding house in a comfortable quiet that felt to Cora like something she had not had in a very long time. Not loneliness filling in exactly, but something broader easing. Like a gate she had been holding shut for a long time and had perhaps, just slightly, let swing open an inch. He came by again the next morning to ask if she knew of a good bootmaker, because one of his men had split a sole and needed it repaired before the drive. She did know. She sent him to old Tom Breslin on the far end of Main Street, and he thanked her and started down the porch steps and then stopped. "Would you have supper with me tonight?" he asked. He turned to look up at her from the second step, which put them nearly level in height, and he was looking at her with a directness that he had applied to maps and routing errors and creek water levels, and which, applied to her, made something in her chest do a small complicated thing. "Not for maps, just for supper." Cora held the porch railing. The morning light was already hot on the boards. Down the street, someone was opening a shop and the sign above the door was swinging. "Pearl Hutchins makes a reasonable beef stew on Thursdays," Cora said, which was not a no, and they both knew it. 7 o'clock, Wesley said. 7 o'clock, she agreed. He put his hat on and walked down Elm Street, and Cora went inside and sat down in the kitchen, and put her hands flat on the table and breathed slowly, and then stood up and got on with her morning because there was bread to make and accounts to settle, and she firmly reminded herself, a practical woman. The supper at Pearl's that Thursday evening was the kind of thing that Cora had afterward difficulty describing accurately, not because anything remarkable happened, but because everything about it felt remarkably natural, which was its own kind of remarkable. They sat at a corner table in Pearl's saloon, which Pearl had furnished over the years with a degree of unexpected decency, actual tablecloths on the 4 tables she kept for dining, and a lamp on each one that gave the whole place a warmth quite different from its afternoon character. They talked about everything and nothing in the easy, ranging way of people who have discovered that their minds move at a similar pace. He told her about a cattle drive in 1875 that had gone very wrong in a very slow, grinding way, where the problems accumulated one after another like a slow flood, rather than a dramatic disaster. and how the hardest lesson he had ever learned was that sometimes the correct response to an accumulating disaster was not to try harder but to stop, reassess, and change direction entirely. She told him about the winter of 1876 when 3 of her boarders had become ill with fever simultaneously, and she had managed the nursing and the household and the accounts and the cold with a determination that had left her, come spring, utterly exhausted and also, strangely, more certain of herself than she had ever been. "You did not ask for help?" he asked. "I did not know how to," she said honestly. "My father taught me self-sufficiency the way other fathers teach their daughters embroidery, thoroughly and without questioning whether it was entirely appropriate." "Is that still true?" he asked. "That you do not know how to ask for help?" It was a very direct question. She looked at her hands around her coffee cup. "I am improving," she said, slowly. He nodded once. He did not push it. She appreciated that more than she could have easily articulated. They ate Pearl's stew, which was, as advertised, reasonable, and Pearl refilled their coffee twice with the carefully neutral expression of a woman who was noticing everything and would be discussing it with the dressmaker before noon the next day. Cora did not mind. She had lived in Harlan's Crossing long enough to know that a woman eating supper with a man was not itself remarkable, and that anything Pearl said would be accurate, which was more than could be said for most town gossip. Walking back to the boarding house afterward in the warm dark of a Texas summer night, the stars thrown across the sky with the particular prodigality of a landscape with no trees to interrupt the horizon, Wesley said, "I leave the day after tomorrow." "I know," Cora said. They walked in silence for half a block. "I would like to write to you," he said, "if you would be willing to receive letters." Cora stopped walking. He stopped too. They stood in the road, the lamplight from the boarding house porch reaching only part of the way to where they were, and she looked at him. "Why?" she asked. It was not a coy question. She genuinely wanted to understand what he meant by it. "Because I find that I am not ready for this conversation to be over," he said. "And because the drive goes back to the King Ranch, and I will be back through this part of the territory in 4 months at the most, and I think 4 months is a long time to go without talking to someone who's thinking I find this valuable." Cora stood very still. The night was warm around them, the dust of the road cool underfoot, and in the distance a coyote made its thin sound and was answered somewhere farther out. She thought about the ledger she kept of things she was certain of and things she was not, and she thought about which column this fell into and found, to her considerable surprise, that it fell into neither. It was its own category, new and uncharted, and she was a woman who had been raised to take new terrain seriously. "You may write," she said. "I will write back, provided you give me something worth responding to." "I will endeavor to be interesting," he said gravely, and the almost smile was back, and this time it completed itself, and she found that his full smile was something she was entirely unprepared for because it changed the whole landscape of his face. She smiled back before she could decide whether to, and then they were both smiling in the dark road in front of the boarding house, and Cora Conley thought, clearly and without apology, that she was in a considerable amount of trouble. He left on a Friday morning, before she was out of the kitchen, which she had told herself was not going to be an occasion, and then found herself standing at the kitchen window watching the trail of dust from the departing herd, until it was nothing but a disturbance at the far edge of the horizon. One of her boarders, Mr. Adler, a retired surveyor who had been staying at the boarding house for 6 months while he finished his land report, came in for his coffee and observed without looking up from his cup that Wesley Rhodes seemed like a steady sort of man. "He is," Cora said, and went to check the bread. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later, which was about as fast as the mail rider could manage given the distances involved. It was written on good paper in Wesley's economical handwriting, and it contained a description of the Western Fork route that was precise and exact and beautifully observed, including a note that the footing past Caldwell's Ridge was exactly as she had described, and that one of his drovers had remarked on the unusually easy going, and Wesley had chosen not to explain why. At the end, almost as a footnote, he described the sunset over the King Ranch from the hilltop past the south pasture as something he wished she could have seen, and then, without transition, asked whether the creek level in Harlan's crossing had risen with the recent rains or whether the Harmon brothers' diversion was still causing problems. Cora read the letter twice. Then she sat at her father's desk and wrote back 4 pages without particular effort, covering the creek, a disagreement she had observed between 2 of the local ranchers about grazing rights that was heading toward the marshal's office with the ponderous inevitability of a slow landslide, the arrival of a new family in town who had a wagon full of books they were selling, and from whom she had acquired 3 volumes she was very pleased about, and at the end, a description of the stars over Harlan's crossing on a clear night that she had been thinking about writing down for some time, and found she now had a reason to. She wrote 12 letters over 4 months. He wrote 11, which she found entirely excusable given his circumstances, and each one was more detailed and more personal than the last. And by the end of October, she was reading them in the sitting room by the lamp with a cup of tea. And she had to be honest with herself that the warm, specific feeling this produced was not a civic contribution or a practical arrangement, but something considerably more consequential than either. He arrived back in Harlan's crossing on a Thursday in early November, riding ahead of a smaller purchasing drive, looking somewhat thinner in the face than when he had left, but otherwise entirely himself. Cora was sweeping the porch when she saw him come down Main Street, and she stopped sweeping and held the broom and watched him approach and made no particular attempt to rearrange her expression into something more neutral because she suspected it would not work anyway. He pulled up at the gate. He looked at her from the saddle. He said, "The western route added exactly half a day on the outbound, made it up on the flat stretch as you said." "I am glad it worked," she said. "Everything you told me worked," he said. He dismounted. He tied the horse to the post with practiced ease and came through the gate and stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her, and the sunlight was doing the complicated thing with the shadows along his jaw again. "Everything you have written has been worth receiving." "So has everything you have written," Cora said. "Good," he said. "I want it to be interesting." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and it surprised her slightly, the sound of it, freer than she usually let herself be, and she saw something in his expression shift toward something very warm. He stayed in Harlan's crossing for 6 days for the purchasing drive's business. He stayed at the boarding house, in the room that had been empty since Mr. Adler's report was completed, and he had moved on in September. He ate breakfast with the other boarders and supper occasionally at Pearl's, and spent most evenings sitting in the boarding house sitting room, talking with Cora with the lamp between them and the old map spread out, not because there was any navigational work to be done now, but because it had become the comfortable surface on which they talked about everything else. He talked about his brothers, one of whom had a farm in Gonzales County, and 2 of whom had moved north, one to Kansas and one to Colorado, in search of something he described as the specific restlessness of men who did not know what they were looking for but were convinced it was somewhere else. He talked about what he wanted, which surprised her because men who talked about what they wanted with any clarity were unusual in her experience, and what Wesley Rhodes wanted was something considerably simpler than most people's ambitions. He wanted good work, honest dealing, and a place that was genuinely his, not in terms of land necessarily, but in terms of belonging. "Do you have that yet?" she asked. He looked at her steadily across the lamp. "I am working on it," he said. On the 5th day of his visit, they walked to the creek again, and the water was higher now with the fall rains, and the light was different, gold-edged and slanting, with a chill underneath that promised winter. They stood on the bank for a while just watching the water. "I have been thinking," Wesley said. "About what?" Cora asked, though she had a sense, accurate as a compass reading, of approximately where this was going. "About what I said in the summer," he said. "About writing to you because the conversation was worth continuing." "I remember," she said. "The conversation has been worth continuing," he said. He was looking at the water as he spoke, which was not his usual way. He usually looked directly at whatever he was addressing. It has been more than worth continuing. I think about it every day. I think about the letters before I write them, and after I send them, and while I am waiting for yours. I think about this town at the strangest moments. On the trail in the dark when you can hear the cattle settling. At first light when the land is empty and quiet. He stopped. He turned and looked at her. I think about you, he said. Specifically and persistently, and I have decided to tell you that, because I have found that sitting on good information until it becomes irrelevant is a mistake. Cora looked at the creek. The water was cold and clear over the stones at the edge. She thought about the ledger of certainties, and about what it meant when something that had felt uncertain revealed itself clearly, the way the western route had revealed itself clearly when she looked at it properly. I think about you too, she said. Specifically and persistently. He was quiet. The water ran over its stones. Good, he said finally. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with a warmth that was unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, and she found she wanted to step toward it. She found she did. He kissed her beside Miller Creek in the cold November light, one hand curved at her jaw with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous with the size of it, and she kissed him back with the certainty of a woman who has thought things through and arrived at a conclusion she is confident in. They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand through the edge of town, and no one who saw them appeared particularly surprised, which told Cora more about how she had been conducting herself over the past 4 months than she might have preferred to know. That evening, he helped her with the supper dishes, which no one had helped her with in 3 years except on the occasional Christmas, and the ordinariness of it was so unexpectedly moving that she had to look out the window for a moment and collect herself. I have to go back Sunday, he said from beside her at the sink. I know, she said. The ranch has a spring drive starting in March. I will be coming back through Harlan's crossing in February to finalize the supply contracts. He paused. I will be back in February, Cora. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that steady, unhurried quality as if he had all the time he needed and was quite sure of how to use it. I will be here, she said. I will still be running the boarding house and you will still need somewhere to stay. Yes, he said. The almost smile was back, fully committed this time. That is extremely convenient. She threw the dish towel at him. He caught it without apparent difficulty and hung it back on the hook, and she laughed again, and the sound of it in her father's kitchen in the warm light felt like something she had been quietly waiting for without knowing it. He left Sunday morning. This time she did not stand at the kitchen window watching the dust. She stood on the porch and watched him ride down Elm Street until he reached the corner of Main, and he turned in the saddle and lifted his hat to her, and she raised one hand, and then he was gone around the corner. She went inside and got on with her day and was only briefly unreasonable about it. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was not an easy one for Harlan's Crossing. A hard frost in December damaged several families' root crops, and the town organized what relief it could, Cora contributing from her own stores with the practicality of someone who had learned to keep a good pantry. And the boarding house became something of a gathering point for women coordinating the distribution of supplies, which was a practical arrangement that also happened to be the closest thing the town had to organized community welfare. She wrote to Wesley about all of it, about the frost and the organizing and old Marshall Greer's effort to establish a proper relief fund, and the arguments about how to administer it. And Wesley wrote back with detailed interest and a suggestion, derived from something he had seen organized in a town further south after a similar winter hardship, about establishing a rotating food store managed by the women's group. She brought the idea to the next meeting, and it was adopted with modifications by Pearl Hutchins and 3 others, and she wrote to Wesley about its adoption, and he wrote back that he was glad it was useful. She found herself thinking, not for the first time, that he was the easiest person she had ever known to think with. February came with a cold brightness that made the plains look like they had been scrubbed. Wesley arrived on a Tuesday, 2 days ahead of when she had expected him, and knocked on the boarding house door while she was in the middle of doing accounts. She opened the door with the ledger still in her hand. He looked at the ledger. "I can wait," he said. "You absolutely cannot," she said, and stood back to let him in, and was perhaps not as good at concealing her relief at seeing him as she would have liked. He looked well. He looked, she thought, like he had been doing a great deal of thinking. He settled into the boarding house with the ease of a man who has arrived somewhere he considers his, hung his hat on the hook by the door, and accepted coffee in the kitchen while she finished the column she had been working on, which he correctly did not interrupt. When she closed the ledger, he said, without preamble, "I have been offered a position." She put her hands on the table. "What kind?" "Trail boss, permanent hire, for a cattle operation based out of Caldwell. It is a smaller operation than the King Ranch, but the contract is full year, and there is a house that comes with the position." He was watching her carefully. "It is 2 days' ride north of Harlan's Crossing." Cora was very still. "That is quite close," she said. "It is deliberately close," he said. He put his coffee cup down with the care of a man making a deliberate gesture. "I want to be clear about what I am saying, Cora. I took the meeting about the position because of where it was located. I would not have been particularly interested in it otherwise. The King Ranch is good work, but the King Ranch is not 2 days from Harlan's Crossing." She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, someone on Main Street was calling to a neighbor across the road, and a horse somewhere was making itself known, and the ordinary life of the town went on around the boarding house the way it always did. "What are you asking me?" she said very precisely. "I am asking you," he said, with a straightforwardness that she had come to understand was simply how he was built, all the way through, no performance anywhere, whether there is a future in this for both of us, not as a vague possibility. As something we are both making a decision about. Cora stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden, which was dormant and gray under the February sky, and she thought about her father and about the boarding house and about the ledger she kept of certainties. She thought about 4 months of letters and 2 stays at this boarding house and a kiss by a creek and a man who had come back to have his maps corrected because she had been right. "I will tell you what I know," she said, turning back to him. "I know that I have not looked forward to anything the way I have looked forward to your letters in a very long time. I know that this town is where I am from and where I expect to remain, because the boarding house was my father's and it is mine and I will not be leaving it. I know that I have found no occasion to be anything but myself in your company, which is less common than it should be." She folded her hands in front of her. "I do not know what the future looks like exactly. But I think it involves you, and I think it involves Harlan's Crossing, and I am, as a matter of principle, willing to act on information I am confident in." He stood up. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and in the gray February light through the window he looked at her with an expression that had nothing restrained in it at all. "Would you marry me?" he said. "I do not have a ring today. I was not certain enough of my timing to acquire one before arriving, but I will go to the jeweler on Main Street tomorrow morning, and I want you to have whatever you prefer rather than whatever I chose without knowing what you prefer." Cora stared at him. "You came back before you expected to," she said, "because you wanted to ask me this." "Yes," he said, "and you could not wait until you had a ring." "I sat on the information as long as I could stand to," he said. "It became irrelevant adjacent." She laughed, and then she stepped toward him and said, "Yes, Wesley, I will marry you." He folded his arms around her with a solidity and warmth that she thought, leaning into it, was exactly what she would have designed if she had been designing something to lean into. And she felt, in that gray winter kitchen with the cold outside and the lamp on the table and her father's ledger closed on the accounts, that she had arrived somewhere she had not known she was headed and found it was precisely right. They went to the jeweler together the next morning. Cora chose a simple gold band with a small inset stone, a dark garnet that the jeweler said had come up from Mexico, and she chose it because it was the color of the Texas earth at sunset, and because she was not a woman who wanted something that would catch on things. The engagement became known to Harlan's Crossing within about 12 hours, which was roughly the expected timeline for any information Pearl Hutchins witnessed. The response was warm. Marshal Greer stopped Cora on the boardwalk to shake her hand with the gravity of a woman who approved of sensible decisions being made at sensible speeds. Mr. Breslin, the bootmaker, who was something of a town philosopher, observed that it was good to see good sense acknowledged. Several women who had known Cora all her life came by the boarding house over the next few days with food and good wishes, and the particular warmth of people who had watched someone they cared about find something worth finding. Wesley accepted the position with the Caldwell operation and sent his formal notice to the King Ranch, which was received with the professional regret of an employer losing a valued man to reasonable circumstances. He spent the rest of February in Harlan's Crossing, helping Cora begin to think through the practical questions: the boarding house, her establishment in the town, his work 2 days north, what the shape of a life between those 2 points would look like. They talked about it honestly and at length, which was, Cora reflected, the only way she had ever seen Wesley approach anything. He was not interested in her giving up the boarding house. She was its owner and its operator, and it was hers, and he had never entertained the idea that she should surrender it. What they worked toward instead was a plan in which the boarding house continued under her management with a hired assistant for the times he was away, and he would spend stretches of his time in Harlan's Crossing when the operation permitted, and during the drive seasons she would visit Caldwell when she could, and they would manage the distance with the same tool that had sustained them thus far, which was honest communication at reliable intervals. It was not a conventional arrangement for 1879. They both knew that. There were women in Harlan's Crossing who would have pressed her to follow him fully. There were men who would have pressed him to insist on it. Neither of them pressed anything, and Cora was aware that this fact was among the most significant of the many things she had come to understand about who Wesley Rhodes was. They were married in April 1879 in the Harlan's Crossing Church, a modest ceremony with Pearl as witness and Marshal Greer sitting in the front pew with the proprietary satisfaction of a woman who had seen something go right. Wesley's eldest brother, Jacob, rode 3 days from Gonzales County to attend, a tall, quiet man who shook Cora's hand at the reception with an expression of visible relief that his youngest brother had done something sensible. "He has been working towards something for a long time," Jacob said to her quietly when they had a moment. "He just did not know what it was." Cora looked across the room to where Wesley was talking to Pearl with the ease of a man comfortable in the room he is in, and she thought she understood what Jacob meant. "I think he knew what it was," she said. "He just needed to find where it was." Jacob smiled. It was Wesley's smile she saw, not the shape of it but the quality, the complete absence of performance. The first months of their marriage had the texture of something being built with care, the way good structures are built, not quickly but solidly. Wesley left for Caldwell in May for the start of the drive season and was back in Harlan's Crossing by late June for a week's supply procurement. He wrote every week without exception. She wrote back with the same regularity. The letters now had a different quality, more settled but no less engaged, as if the permanence had freed them both from the particular vigilance of courtship and allowed them to be simply themselves on paper. She hired a young woman named Ruth Alcott, recently arrived in Harlan's Crossing with her widowed mother, to help with the boarding house in the mornings and for the heavier laundry work. Ruth was 18, eager and surprisingly competent, and the arrangement freed Cora's afternoons considerably, which she used partly for reading and partly for expanding the kitchen garden into a genuine productive plot that she had been wanting to develop for 3 years. When Wesley came back through in June, he stood at the garden's edge for a long moment looking at it with a quiet respect. "This is considerably larger than it was," he said. "I had the time," she said. "Ruth is good." "She is," he agreed, having met Ruth at breakfast. "What is that row at the far edge?" "Beans," Cora said, and squash on the other side of the fence. The Morales family at the end of Elm Street showed me their planting method. It is considerably more efficient than what I was doing before. She hesitated and then said, without making a ceremony of it, I asked for help. He looked at her. That warmth was in his face. The full, unguarded version that she had come to understand was not given out easily, and having been given was entirely sincere. How was it? He asked. Effective, she said. The beans are excellent. He laughed, a real full laugh, and put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood at the edge of the growing garden in the June heat. And Cora felt the specific quality of happiness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of something solid to stand on. By the end of that summer, it was clear to Cora that she was expecting a child, which she had hoped for and approached with the same careful practicality she applied to everything else, which meant she informed herself thoroughly, engaged the services of the town's experienced midwife, Mrs. Clara Hollies, and wrote to Wesley immediately rather than waiting to tell him in person, which she knew she could have done but which felt wrong, a withholding of information that was simply not in her nature. His letter in response arrived in a week and a half, which was faster than a letter had any reasonable business arriving, and it was the least economical piece of writing she had ever received from him, running to 6 full pages that covered his happiness, his plans to be in Harlan's Crossing well before March, his conversations with his employer about reduced travel during the coming winter, and at the end, a passage that she read several times in the lamplight. I want to be there, he wrote. I want to be there the way I want to be there for all of it, every ordinary day of it, not because it is my duty, but because it is my preference, and I think the most important thing I have learned in the last year is the difference between those two things. He was in Harlan's Crossing by December, having negotiated with the Caldwell operation a winter arrangement that kept his position secure, while allowing him the months at the boarding house that the coming spring would require. He settled back into the boarding house with the ease of a man returning to himself, helped Cora with the winter preparations, chopped wood with a methodical efficiency that impressed even Mr. Adler, who had stopped through on his way back from a new survey assignment, and stayed 3 days catching them up on the wider world. March brought Jacob Conley Rhodes into the world on a cold, bright morning, with Mrs. Hollies presiding and Wesley present, which was not the universal practice of the time, and which Mrs. Hollies had raised an eyebrow about and then been too busy to pursue. He was healthy and loud and regarding, with dark eyes that Mrs. Hollies said were very common at birth and meant nothing, and that Cora thought looked exactly like Wesley's. Wesley held his son with the particular care of a very large man handling something very small and important, and his face did something Cora had never seen it do, not breaking exactly, but opening all the way, as though something that had been quietly closed for a long time had chosen now to be otherwise. Jacob, he said quietly to the infant, as if introducing himself. Jacob Conley Rhodes, Cora said from the bed, watching them. He looked up at her. Conley, he said, I want that. I know you do, she said. I suggested it. The smile broke across his face all the way, and she thought, as she thought at least once every day, that she was deeply grateful for the afternoon in Pearl's saloon when she had opened her mouth and told this man he was wrong. Life in Harlan's Crossing with a new baby, a boarding house, and a husband who was away for stretches of the spring and summer was busy in the particular way of a life that is full rather than overloaded, though the distinction was sometimes narrow. Cora managed it with the same discipline she had always applied to everything, augmented now by Ruth Alcott's steadily increasing competence, and by the informal network of women in the town who had been through their own versions of this and applied their knowledge generously. The Morales family, who had taught her the bean planting, also provided invaluable guidance on infant matters, specifically from their grandmother, an elderly woman named Senora Fuentes, whose English was limited but whose communication was, in Cora's experience, among the clearest she had ever encountered. Senora Fuentes had strong opinions about fresh air, and the value of not wrapping babies too tightly, and the importance of mothers sleeping when they could, opinions which she delivered with such compelling authority that Cora followed them without question, and found all of them to be correct. Wesley came back for 2 weeks in July, and 2 weeks in October, and by November was back full-time for the winter, and those stretches of full cohabitation had a quality of deepening rather than simply continuing. He changed with Jacob in a way Cora watched with a quiet, private happiness, not dramatically, not with great declarations, but in the small daily ways of a man who is learning a new language and finding he has more aptitude for it than he expected. He read to the baby from whatever was at hand, which was often entirely inappropriate in terms of content but apparently satisfactory in terms of rhythm, since Jacob seemed to find Cattle Trail accounting every bit as soothing as the illustrated alphabet book that Pearl had sent over. "He does not understand any of it," Cora pointed out. "He understands the voice," Wesley said, not looking up from the page. "My father used to read to us from farm journals. I cannot remember a word of it, but I remember the sound." She sat with that for a moment. "What was your father like?" He considered it. "Like me," he said, "before I figured some things out." "What things?" "That being right is only useful if you are willing to find out when you are wrong," he said, with the economy of a man who has thought about something for a long time and arrived at its essence. He looked up at her then with the full direct quality that still, 2 years in, did something to her composure. A woman in a saloon in Harlan's Crossing was somewhat influential in that education. "She sounds formidable," Cora said. "Entirely," he said. The years settled into a rhythm that was irregular enough to stay interesting and solid enough to be depended upon. Wesley's reputation as a trail boss grew steadily, and by 1882, he was being consulted on routing and logistics by operations well beyond the Caldwell area, which brought him additional income and also additional correspondence, and their kitchen table became something of a permanent map depository that Cora navigated around with the ease of long practice. She had expanded the boarding house by 1881, adding 2 rooms and a back addition that Wesley had designed with the help of the local builder, and that she had funded from 3 years of careful ledger management. The expansion meant 4 more boarders at any given time, which meant Ruth Alcott was promoted from assistant to assistant manager, with a corresponding pay increase that caused Ruth to look as though she might produce happy tears, which she then professionally declined to produce. Cora's second pregnancy came in 1882, and this time a girl, born on a September afternoon when Wesley was away in Caldwell, but arrived home within the week, having ridden without stopping for most of 2 days when the letter reached him. The girl was named Mary after Cora's mother, who had died when Cora was 7, and of whom she had only careful, preserved memories, and James for her father, so Mary James Rhodes, which was entirely too much name for someone 8 pounds and new to the world, but which settled into something like the right weight of name as she grew into it. Mary was, from her earliest weeks, a distinct personality. Where Jacob had been observant and quiet, watching everything from under his dark brows, Mary regarded the world as though it had been arranged for her specific interest, and she had every intention of examining all of it. By the time she was pulling herself upright on the furniture, she had identified every removable object in the boarding house at her height, and removed each one systematically. And Cora told Wesley in a letter that their daughter was conducting research into the nature of gravity. "She is her mother's child," he wrote back, and she could hear the smile in it. He was in Harlan's Crossing for Mary's first birthday, which coincided with Jacob's 3rd, and the double celebration had the chaotic warmth of a household that had accumulated enough in it to require actual management. Pearl Hutchins came. Marshall Greer came, now retired but still possessed of the same no-nonsense warmth that had made her beloved. The Morales family came in force. Ruth Alcott came with her own news, a quiet announcement that she was engaged to the new schoolteacher, Mr. Frank Elliott, who had arrived from Colorado in the spring and turned out to have a shy, bookish nature that was entirely compatible with Ruth's capable, organized one. Cora had watched Ruth's courtship with the particular interest of someone who recognized the early stages of something real and wanted it to go well for people she cared about. She had, when Ruth asked, said a few things that she hoped were useful, primarily that the most important quality in a person you were going to spend your life with was not any particular characteristic, but the fundamental willingness to be in genuine conversation with you for the duration, which required honesty more than charm, though charm was not unwelcome. Ruth's wedding was in the summer of 1883, a warm day in the town's small church, and Cora stood at the back with Mary on her hip and Jacob pressing his face into her skirt, and watched Ruth walk down the aisle with the uprightness of a woman who was certain, and thought about a winter afternoon in a boarding house kitchen with a cold February light, and a man who had not had a ring, but had not been able to sit on the information any longer. Wesley was beside her, and she took his hand without looking at him, and he held it without looking at her, and they watched Ruth and Frank Elliott begin their life together with the quiet of people who have been doing that themselves for a while and know what it looks like from the inside. In 1884, Wesley was offered a partnership in the Caldwell operation, which was significant and required careful thinking. He came home for 2 weeks to think it through with Cora, which was not something he had asked permission for, simply something he had done without question, because she was who he thought best with, and that was where they were. They spent those 2 weeks talking through the implications. The partnership would mean more stability, more income, and more responsibility, and also, potentially, more time away during the first years of the new arrangement. It also meant real investment in the operation, which required capital, which was not unlimited. Cora reviewed their accounts, which she kept with the same careful precision she had always kept them. She reviewed the boarding house's income over 3 years, the expansion costs, the current reserves, and set it all in front of him on the kitchen table. "You have the capital," she said. "Barely, but you do. The boarding house can sustain itself without drawing from your reserves. The question is whether this partnership is what you want." He looked at the numbers for a long time. He looked up at her. "Is it what you want?" he said. "That is also a relevant question." "I want you to be doing work you respect," she said. "I want you to be coming home knowing you dealt fairly with people and the land. A partnership seems likely to give you more capacity to do that than a hired position does." "Yes," he said. "That is what I think too." He accepted the partnership. The extra travel it required in the first 2 years was managed with letters, and with the efficient domestic machinery that Cora had built around the boarding house, and with the 2 children who grew and changed and required new calibrations on a regular basis. Jacob was, by 5, reading with the focused determination of someone who has identified something he is good at and intends to be better at it. Mary was, by 3, conducting what appeared to be negotiations with the chickens in the garden, with a combination of authority and diplomacy that Cora recognized, slightly uncomfortably, from her own general approach to difficult conversations. By 1886, the boarding house had completed a second small expansion. The kitchen garden produced enough surplus that Cora had entered into a quiet arrangement with Pearl's Kitchen for a regular supply, and Wesley's partnership had turned the Caldwell operation into something genuinely successful. He came home to Harlan's Crossing more frequently now, the senior year of the partnership having established enough systems that his physical presence at the operation was required less continuously. He came home for 3 weeks in the fall of 1886 and did not, that year, go back for winter. He spent December in the boarding house and January, and in February he sat at the kitchen table with Cora and said, "I think I want to make a permanent arrangement." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "You are already permanently arranged," she said. "We have been married 7 years. "I mean that I want to be here," he said. "Primarily, permanently. The partnership can run with my quarterly visits and my correspondence. Tom Hadley, his junior partner, has the operation well in hand. I do not need to be in Caldwell 9 months of the year to maintain this. He looked at her directly. I want to be here, with you and Jacob and Mary. This is where I want to be. Cora set her cup down carefully. She thought about the man who had ridden into Harlan's crossing in the summer of 1878 with the wrong routing information, and a habit of being the most informed person in the room that had not yet met its limit. She thought about all the miles of paper between them, all the careful, honest words, and the creek bank in November, and a cold February morning and a question asked without a ring. "You are going to need an office," she said. "I will not have your maps on the kitchen table permanently. It is not hygienic with 2 children." He smiled, all the way that still undid something in her carefully maintained composure, and said, "I will build one." Onto the back past the new rooms. "You will hire someone to build it," she corrected. "You are not a carpenter." "I will supervise the building of one," he amended. "Better," she said. He was home, properly, permanently, without the counting of days until departure. He set up his correspondence in a small back office that the builder completed in March, and he managed the Caldwell partnership from there. And he was present for Jacob's starting school in the fall of 1887, which Jacob approached with the seriousness of someone who had been preparing for this his whole 7 years, and for Mary's growing vocabulary, which was expanding rapidly in both English and the Spanish she absorbed from Senora Fuentes, with an ease that suggested a natural aptitude. The town grew around them. The railroad did come to Harlan's crossing in 1888, and Cora's prediction proved partly correct. The growth was real and significant, and not all of it was what had made the place worth living in. New people arrived with new money and new assumptions, and some of what had been the intimate texture of a frontier town began to acquire the different texture of a proper small city. Cora watched it with the thoughtful attention of someone who had been observing this town her whole life, and understood that change is not inherently loss, though it requires active care to ensure the things worth keeping are actually kept. She was involved, along with Pearl and several others, in the establishment of a proper town library, housed in a building donated by a merchant who had arrived on the first train and turned out to have the unexpected quality of caring about books. She was on the committee. She had opinions. Several of her opinions were adopted. One was not, and she noted her disagreement in the committee minutes and let it be. "You did not push the library matter harder," Wesley observed one evening. He had been at the meeting. "I made my case," she said. "The committee made its decision, noting it is sufficient for now. You think they will come around?" "In 2 years," she said. "When the initial approach has the problems I said it would have, then we can revisit it." He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to understand was his admiration expression, which he deployed without ceremony and which she had never in nearly 10 years entirely gotten used to. "You are very patient for someone as certain of things as you are," he said. "I am not patient," she said. "I am strategic. There is a difference." "Considerable," he agreed, and reached across the table for her hand. The boarding house in 1889 was 10 years under Cora's sole management, counting from her father's passing, and she marked this not with any particular ceremony, but with the satisfaction of the annual ledger review, which showed the operation healthy and growing and entirely sound. Wesley looked over her shoulder as she reviewed the figures with the interest of a man who had learned, through 9 years of marriage to Cora Conley, that her ledgers were never merely financial documents, but a kind of ongoing conversation with the shape of things. Jacob was 9 and reading everything in the new library with a systematic approach that the librarian found both impressive and slightly alarming. Mary was 6 and had transferred her diplomatic negotiations from the chickens to her schoolmates with apparently good results, the teacher having remarked to Cora that Mary had an unusual gift for resolving disputes among the other children before they became the teacher's problem. "She takes after you," Wesley said when Cora relayed this. "She takes after both of us," Cora said. She has your way of assessing a room. He thought about this. That is a good combination, he said. Extremely, Cora agreed. In the fall of 1889, they learned there would be a third child, which they had not been anticipating at this particular moment, but received with the warmth of people who had enough established under them to welcome whatever came with the stability of good ground. Cora was 37, which Mrs. Hollis noted required somewhat more care than the previous 2 pregnancies, and Cora, who applied thoroughness to everything, was thorough about this. She rested when rest was indicated, ate what was recommended, and permitted Wesley to be considerably more solicitous than she might otherwise have allowed, because she was honest enough with herself to know that solicitousness was not always interference, and sometimes was simply love. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas Wesley Rhodes, arrived in June of 1890 on a warm summer evening, healthy and undramatic about it, which Cora appreciated. He was from his earliest hours a tranquil, watchful child who observed everything from under pale lashes that were his and no one else's, and who smiled with a sweetness that was equally unprecedented in their family, and that Jacob, aged 9 and grave about it, declared was very agreeable for a baby. Wesley held Thomas the same way he had held Jacob, with the enormous careful gentleness, and Cora watched from the bed and felt the full settled weight of everything they had built, the house and the ledger and the children, and the maps on the office wall and the letters bundled in the box in the sitting room going back to 1878. All of it accumulated not by accident, but by the particular combination of honesty and willingness, and the specific courage it takes to say something important without being certain of how it will land. She thought about a summer afternoon in a saloon, and a woman with a head full of her father's knowledge and 12 years of reading, and no patience for incorrect information delivered with absolute confidence. She thought about the silence that had followed her voice. She thought about a man who had looked up from his maps and asked a genuine question and come back the next morning. She thought about all of it, and found it exactly the right shape of a life. The years that followed had the quality of something ripe. Jacob, grown into a serious and deeply well-read young man, began studying law at 17, corresponding with a lawyer in San Antonio who had known James Conley and took a particular interest in the Conley man's grandson. He was going to be good at it, Cora thought, in the way she thought about things she was sure of, which was simply and clearly and without requiring to announce it. Mary, at 15, was teaching herself to play the church organ with the same systematic determination she had applied to everything else, and was also, Cora noticed, beginning to observe the young men of Harlan's crossing with the assessing quality she had inherited from Wesley, which Cora thought would serve her well when she eventually applied it to the question of who deserved her serious consideration. Thomas was, at 4 and then 5, an undemanding, contented child who followed Wesley around the boarding house yard, with the serene conviction that wherever his father was going was the correct direction. Wesley, who had never expected to be the kind of man whose shadow was followed by a small child in a sun hat, had adapted to this with a naturalness that still, 10 years into observing him as a father, moved Cora in ways she did not always have words for. Ruth Elliott, born Alcott, had 3 children of her own by 1893 and managed the boarding house mornings with a quiet authority that was indistinguishable from Cora's own by now. Pearl Hutchins, who had been diagnosed with a persistent chest complaint in 1891 and had retired from active saloon management to a chair by her window with a cup of tea and an opinion about everything, was still a reliable presence at the end of Main Street and still the fastest conduit for accurate information in Harlan's Crossing, a town that by 1893 had a proper newspaper, a school that ran to 8th grade, 2 churches, and a real bank with a vault, and which was, as Cora had predicted, both larger and different and still, in its essential parts, the place she had grown up in. She sat on her porch on a September evening in 1893, 15 years after she had come back from delivering Pearl's message, and heard a man say something wrong in a saloon, and watched the main street in the long light. The children were in the house. Wesley was in the back office, which was visible from the corner of her eye, the lamp lit, the shadow of him moving over the map-covered wall with the particular quality of his movement that she could identify at this distance without effort. She thought about her father, who had taught her to think for herself and read maps, and keep an honest ledger and speak clearly when she knew what she was talking about. She thought about the woman she had been at 26, precise and self-sufficient, and a little sealed against the particular kinds of vulnerability that come with wanting something badly enough to be disappointed by not getting it. She thought about how she had not known she was that sealed until she had found herself, somewhat against all expectation, being opened. The screen door behind her opened and Wesley came out, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and sat in the chair next to hers with the ease of someone returning to the position they occupy habitually. He handed her a cup. "Tom is asleep," he said. "Jacob is reading. Mary is playing the organ so quietly I suspect she thinks we cannot hear her. She always plays more confidently when she thinks no one is listening," Cora said. "She should learn to play confidently when they are. It is better music." "You could tell her that," Wesley said. "I will," Cora said, "when the moment is right." He settled back in his chair. The evening was warm still, the summer holding on at the edge of the season, and the sky was going from orange to deep blue at the horizon in the way of Texas evenings that seemed to take the whole day's light and condense it into the last 20 minutes. Down the street, a lamp came on in a window. Someone laughed from the direction of what used to be Pearl's saloon and was now a proper restaurant, though Pearl still dropped by to assess the quality of the coffee. Wesley was looking at the street with the watching quality that had never left him, the assessing, cataloging habit of a man who has spent years needing to understand terrain quickly. But there was a difference now from the man who had come into Harlan's crossing in 1878 with his incorrect maps. He was not calculating distances to exits. He was simply looking at the world he was in and finding it where he wished to be. Cora knew this because she knew him, the way you know a landscape you have lived in long enough to read its changes as information rather than interruption, the way you know the difference between the spring light and the fall light even when the temperature is the same. She knew him the way she knew her ledgers, completely, current to the last entry, and she knew that this was where he was. "What are you thinking?" he asked, not looking away from the street. "That I am glad I said something that afternoon," Cora said. "In Pearl's saloon." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I thought about that moment for weeks afterward, what it was like to have someone just say it, clearly. Without apology, just, 'You are wrong and here is why.' You needed to hear it," she said. "I needed to hear it from someone who knew what they were talking about," he said. "There is a difference. I had been told I was wrong before, by men who were less right than I was." He paused. "You were simply right." "I usually am," she said. He looked at her then sideways, and the smile was there all the way with 15 years behind it. "You usually are," he agreed. They sat on the porch while the sky went from deep blue to dark, and the stars began to assemble themselves over Harlan's crossing with the particular abundance of a sky that has no competition from the below. And the children were in the house, and the office lamp was still lit through the window, and the September air was warm and full of the smell of the kitchen garden. And Cora Conley Rhodes held her coffee cup in both hands the way she always had, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be, which was the only kind of place she had ever been willing to stay. She had spoken into a saloon silence and offered a correction to a man who needed it, and he had been the kind of man who came back the next morning, and everything else had followed from those 2 true things the way honest maps follow from honest ground, which is to say completely and in the right direction, all the way to here. The stars were very bright over Harlan's crossing. They always were. The coyotes were at it somewhere out past the edge of town, thin and wild in the dark, and from inside the house there was the very quiet, very deliberate sound of Mary playing the organ as though she thought no one could hear her. The music was hesitant and then confident and then hesitant again, reaching for something she could almost play and finding it in pieces. And Cora thought she would tell her tomorrow, clearly and without apology. Play as though someone is listening. It is better music. You will be glad you did. Wesley reached over without looking at her and took her hand the way he had been doing for 15 years, and she let him hold it the way she had been letting him for exactly as long. And the night settled around them, warm and full and entirely complete.